There is a substance that produces deeply intricate visuals and eerie, familiar, but alien landscapes. And these trips have the power to transform and ultimately shape lives forever. The effects hit in about 10 minutes, last for about 2 hours. And after everything is done, you will most likely say it was the deepest psychedelic trip of your entire life. And the most surprising thing is, you've probably never heard of the substance. This substance is called DMXE, deoxymethoxytamine, and it's considered a dissociative, which is the same class of substance as ketamine. There are some that say dissociatives shouldn't be classified as psychedelics, and my response to that is always, well, you haven't taken enough. DMXE is actually an offshoot of another dissociative called MXE, and within this big, happy MXE family are other substances like MXIPR. However, when it comes to all the sciencey stuff like receptor binding and sigmoidal curves, DMXE is more similar to MXE than any other dissociative in the MXE family. And if you haven't heard of MXE or DMXE, it's because it's fairly new. MXE first hit the scene in the UK on October 9th, 2010. Back then, there was a site in which you could legally purchase MXE. It was presented as a bladder-friendly alternative to ketamine, since ketamine, in high, frequent doses, can have negative impact on your bladder. However, even though MXE was marketed as a bladder-friendly alternative, there have been no studies looking at MXE's effect on the bladder. MXE gained incredible popularity in the UK underground scene around 2012 due to its longer lasting and more powerful effects when compared to ketamine. However, all of this came crashing down in 2014 when the European Commission banned MXE in the EU on June 16th, 2014. But during the pandemic in 2021, DMXE hit the scene in Europe, and it's been providing some of the most mind-bending trips ever since. But what are these mind-bending and deep trips all about? Well, one of the most unique things about DMXE when compared to other substances is that it produces an ineffable experience. By definition, that means it's literally impossible to describe. But I'll try to do it anyway. Okay, imagine your current life and how you got to this point. It involved having loving parents that provided an enriching childhood, which encouraged you to follow your life passions and achieve your goals. Now, imagine this life process in a different universe with slightly different conditions. Your memories of who you are would be different, and therefore, who you define yourself as would also change. These familiar but alien experiences of a life you've never lived is generally experienced in scenes or even landscapes that change and wash away with each new visual. Sometimes the basis of who you are can be as abstract as believing you exist as an electromagnetic wave in a universe filled with other wave structures. And the other reality, you living as a human tripping on DMXE within a human society, that is the real illusion. But what's going down in the brain to make these deeply significant experiences? The truth is, we don't fully know. At this point, there are no clinical studies of DMXE out there. We can only go from current theories of how this substance works within the brain, and I have a few ideas that I've been establishing for over a year now. The first thing may be the most obvious, but deep DMXE trips are almost always accomplished by occluding the vision, which means closing your eyes. It's best to wear an eye mask to ensure that if you do accidentally open your eyes during the trip, you'll still be in darkness. And why do you want to be in darkness? Because of something your brain does called predictive processing. And it's the leading theory of how we experience our reality. In short, your brain predicts what you see before you even see it. It's constantly talking to itself, estimating what we already know about the world, and fact-checking it with what we are actually seeing. This happens throughout your life. It's a way for your brain to conserve energy. However, when you do psychedelics, this predictive processing engine, it goes nuts. Now your brain is making wild predictions that are not being fact-checked as precise as before. Now to push this psychedelic-induced faulty predictive processing engine further, covering the eyes further increases the amount of intensity of these visual errors or hallucinations. It's called closed eye visuals. The second thing is, the DMXE experience is greatly affected by music. Not just like music sounds better on DMXE, more like the embodiment of the trip becomes the music itself. One person that orally ingested 120 milligrams reported, "I've spent the past 20 minutes inside the audio waves of psytrance music, exploring different worlds and galaxies. I saw familiar realms with the beats of the music bringing me back to real in unreal places. Another person that tried DMXE stated, "The music is getting very intense now. It feels like the music is taking over my body. I feel every pitch having a physical impact on me. I hear all the different beats separately and then forging back into each other." Therefore, having a playlist designed for DMXE is of the highest importance. And if you want to know what type of music is required to have one of these deep trips, watch until the end of the video. One of the most remarkable things about DMXE is the way it moves your body. Not like real physical movement, but phantom movement. My first acute dose with DMXE, I just accepted that someone was dragging my body across the floor. Only when I took my blindfold off did I realize there was no one else in the room with me. The feeling of flying, being pulled, or your body moving like it's on a conveyor belt is a common occurrence under DMXE. We all know the 5 senses of touch, hearing, smell, taste, and vision, but we all have a 6th sense, and it's our vestibular sense. The vestibular sense is our sense of body orientation. It gives our brain information about spatially where we are in the world. Our other senses all have corresponding sensory organs. For example, tongue for taste, eyes for vision. But the vestibular system shares a sensory organ with another sense. Can you guess what that is? It's the ear. Yes, the same mechanism that allows us to hear also gives our sense of body orientation. Could it be that while on DMXE, the music we listen to also directly affects and perhaps makes people feel like their body is moving? But in order for all of this to happen, there must be NMDA receptors inside the ear. And what are NMDA receptors? DMXE, along with ketamine, is an NMDA antagonist. This means DMXE works by blocking NMDA receptors in your brain. Imagine NMDA receptors as key locks scattered across your brain. When these locks are open, these areas of your brain work. Now imagine DMXE spreading across your brain and preventing those locks from opening, which also prevents those areas of your brain from operating. This is how DMXE and ketamine gets its dissociative effects. It removes association through blockage of the NMDA receptor. So we know NMDA receptors are in the brain, but are they in the ear? If they are, then perhaps DMXE is simultaneously modulating the sound we hear and how we perceive our body orientation. It's a question that I've had for a while, and the answer is there are NMDA receptors in the ear. And we know this because NMDA antagonism, which is the blockage of NMDA receptors, is being considered as a therapeutic treatment for tinnitus, which is essentially treatment for auditory hallucinations. Tinnitus is an interesting sensory disorder because the auditory hallucinations flare up whenever there is an absence of sound, occlusion of sound, much like how visual hallucinations increase when there's an occlusion of vision through closed-eye visuals. But is there something as closed vestibular sensations? Yes, absolutely. And it's something I've been researching for nearly a year. The vestibular system has never been a huge emphasis of psychedelic research. In fact, if you Google psychedelic therapy, it usually leads to pictures of people laying on their backs. However, these very defined physical positions like sitting, standing, lying down, it gives one an enormous amount of vestibular sensory information. It's hard to trick the vestibular system. Maybe your eyes played tricks on you before and you saw something that wasn't there, or your ears were tweaking and you thought you heard someone call your name when no one did. But have you ever been standing and thought you were sitting? Or been falling down and thought you were standing? So how do you turn off the vestibular system to have a closed vestibular sensation? The most practical way that is shown to be effective is to plop yourself on an oversized beanbag. Those giant ones that engulf your entire body like a glove. The idea is to create an amorphous physical position that is neither sitting or lying down, like your body is just a blob within another blob. The best way to attain this amorphous spatial position is to ensure your feet and hands aren't touching the ground. Every extremity should be in a spatially ambiguous position. If you take DMXE and occlude or reduce the amount of vestibular input you're receiving by positioning yourself in this giant beanbag, this predictive processing engine that we talked about earlier, it may also malfunction within the vestibular system. Perhaps this results in us thinking we're being pulled, twisted, or flying, when in fact we're just submerged in a closed vestibular beanbag. Just like how when we're tripping we close our eyes, we see things that aren't there, maybe with DMXE, we're feeling body positions that aren't real through our vestibular system. So you know DMXE is an NMDA receptor antagonist, but it also interacts with another extremely interesting receptor, the sigma-1 receptor. High sigma-1 receptor agonism isn't seen in a lot of dissociatives. And ketamine doesn't have significant sigma-1 receptor agonism or activation, but it is prominent in DMXE. So what does this all mean? And maybe even more important, what is the purpose of the sigma-1 receptor in the brain? Let's say you're out playing football. You're running, you accidentally stumble, lose your balance, you fall, and you hit your head. You're knocked out. You're knocked out due to a lack of oxygen in your brain. This is called an ischemic incident. When this happens, your brain releases chemicals that activate specific sigma-1 receptors in the brain. These chemicals interact with these sigma-1 receptors and create a neuroprotective barrier around the areas of your brain that lack oxygen. Almost like a shield that protects your brain cells so they won't weaken or die from a lack of oxygen. Sigma-1 receptor activation promotes cellular survival in the brain. And DMXE activates the sigma-1 receptor. What does this all mean? Does DMXE protect brain cells from dying and also somehow contributes to its deep psychedelic trips? The truth is, we just don't know. That's why it needs to be researched. However, there is another highly mysterious psychedelic substance that also has significant sigma-1 receptor activation, and it's DMT, dimethyltryptamine. DMT is a very powerful psychedelic that creates hyper-real visuals, almost like someone is pushing play on your vision. Visuals that engulf a person, wraps them up in a stunningly real but unreal world. Visions that are rich and bizarre, sort of like DMXE. Could sigma-1 receptor agonism or activation be a factor in the development of bizarre visuals from DMT and DMXE? I don't know, an entire PhD thesis can be written about that question. We just don't know yet. We've talked a lot about what a DMXE trip is and what it does in the brain. But what does it do to behavior in changing life perspectives? This is where DMXE may have its ultimate impact. This past year, I've been documenting cases in which people that have taken DMXE together inside of these giant beanbags have endured significant life changes. In one case, two friends that weren't that close took 50 mg of DMXE and then hopped in one of these vestibularly occluded giant beanbags together. And at the end of their experience, they were both sobbing. Within their DMXE trip, both had a strong emotional connection that translated into them visually seeing each other as amber energy going through one another. One was giving birth to the other was having sex while simultaneously becoming the other at the same time. They said it felt like they were actually having sex within the trip. And it took them hours after their DMXE experience just to calm down. This experience resulted in them actually having sex in the real world a few days later. But the connection they had in the DMXE world didn't quite translate to the real world, and after a couple months, they were no longer together. But don't think DMXE is some substance that can always induce love and affection within two people. It can also go the other way. There's another case in which two people that were dating took 150 mg of DMXE. First in a 50 mg interval, and then later at a giant dose of 100 mg. After their closed vestibular experience, one person was so disassociated that it took them hours to come back to reality. And when they did, they came to the sudden realization that their partner wasn't the right partner for them and broke up the same day. It's clear that DMXE has the ability to produce deep psychedelic and life-changing trips, and that it definitely must be used with extreme caution. Also, there's no clinical studies of DMXE, so we don't fully know the extent of its neurotoxicity. The colloquial dose to have an intense psychedelic DMXE experience is anywhere from 40 to 60 mg insufflated, which means snorted. The effects hit in minutes, so it's important to be ready, have your blindfold, and be inside of a giant beanbag, and of course, have your DMXE playlist ready. I'm sure we'll take a deeper dive on the elements that make DMXE so peculiar. But you just had an amazing crash course on the deeply powerful psychedelic effects of DMXE and how it interacts with the brain. And that DMXE playlist that I mentioned earlier, throughout my research with DMXE over the past year, I, along with a few colleagues, have crafted the best DMXE playlists on the entire planet. I'm not just saying that lightly. Months went into developing this playlist, and it's available right now for all Patreon subscribers. So subscribe at patreon.com/Tipado to get your hands on it. And one last thing, I'm working with SideOut to research DMXE, and they've even made a coin to support this. So if you're into crypto and decentralized science, then have a look. That's the end of this episode of Your Drug on Brains.